Now, for more on this topic, I'm joined now by Goldie Blumenstyk, a senior writer with the Chronicle of Higher Education and author of American Higher Education in Crisis, What Everyone Needs to Know. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Goldie, let's start with a comparison. How much does spending in the US compare with, say, on education in Europe and Asia?
Well, the systems are very different. In Europe and Asia, it's much more government supported. In the United States, we have a system where there's a lot of the revenue for the colleges comes from the students themselves, either from their own pockets or through some federal financial aid and state financial aid programs. So the whole model is really very hard to compare.
And speaking to that model, we know that President Trump has proposed some deep cuts to education, around 14%. So what exactly is the government's financial role when it comes to public education, and how could these budget cuts affect some of the state programs?
A lot of those cuts are actually happening at the K-12, sort of not necessarily in the higher education budgets, though there are some cuts to some key grant programs that help students help colleges provide work-study programs on campuses where students get paid for part-time jobs while they're going to school, and some others of those grant programs. Some of the other cuts are coming out of not necessarily coming out of higher education. They're actually keeping the funding for the Pell Grant program, which is the main student aid program in higher education, though they haven't indexed, in his proposed budget, it wouldn't index it for inflation, so at the end of the day, it might not have as much purchasing power as the Pell Grant has had in the past.
Now, there's certainly a lot of studies that talk about the sort of return on investment that you get once you've kind of accumulated a lot of this student debt. For US students, what is their return on investment looking like these days?
Gosh, you know, that is all over the map. I mean, the trouble with this whole student debt discussion is that there's something like 20 million students in college today. Everybody has a different level of debt load. If you're a student who's taken on a lot of debt, but you're in a program where the job prospects aren't that good, and maybe you've been paying a lot of money for this program, you're in a heap of trouble. But there's still a lot of programs out there that the debt is actually worth the investment, and even more so. I mean, every statistic that we look at about who's doing well in our economy versus who's not, on the whole, the people who have college educations are doing better by far.
And what sort of trends are you seeing in terms of what people are doing after they graduate? You mentioned this idea of kind of going into other sectors that could be more lucrative, where you can get that better return on investment.
You know, I was just struck. I noticed that just the other day, the University of Michigan, they put out this job prospects report, and I think the prospects for this year's graduates are the best they've been in 5 or 6 years. And so apparently whatever's been happening to the economy is finally trickling down into the kinds of jobs that recent college graduates are getting. I mean, gosh, one of the hottest fields is cyber security and cyber technologies, and anything to do with IT security right now. That the gap between the job needs and the numbers of students being graduated in those fields is huge. And so if you're the kind of person who could do that kind of work, you're golden.
Now, we're not sure if that's going to continue, being some of the policies that we're seeing under the Trump administration, whether it's, as we saw in the report, people talking about their concerns over their work visas and what's going to happen in the future. How do you think that's going to affect the idea of international students, whether they want to study in the US or not?
I think it's a huge issue. Whether this budget that the president has proposed is the one that's finally enacted still remains to be seen, and I think it's pretty unlikely, very unlikely, that what he's proposed exactly will get adopted, and many of the changes he's suggesting are not endorsed by Congress. The broader environment, however, the international travel ban on some students coming in from Muslim countries, and just a general sense that the United States is becoming more America first, makes a lot of international students have a lot of fears about coming to college in the United States. So there's also been some violence in the United States involving immigrants and people. That resonates at home in other countries. And there's an international conference going on right this week in California for international educators. It's been topic 1 the whole week.
And so what does that mean then when people are looking into the future, if you're a student and you're kind of planning where you're going to go, in terms of competitiveness? How is that changing the competitiveness market for the US versus, say, other markets?
Oh, Canada. Everyone's talking about Canada these days. I mean, because in the UK there are also some issues. There's the Brexit vote in Canada has made some people, in England, has made some people question whether they want to go to England for universities. So now the United States and England are now finding themselves facing Canada and Australia as sort of the most competitive markets for international students. I think US universities, though, are trying to really combat that. There's been campaigns on campuses to try to encourage international students to continue to come.
Now, we know that Donald Trump, one of his key platforms was this idea of more jobs for Americans. But there are plenty of unfilled jobs, but employers just say they can't find the skilled workers. What can be done then to bridge that gap? Is it still going to be traditional universities or perhaps things like apprenticeships and skills training?
I mean, I think that they call this the middle skills gap. It's sort of that job level that's, you might not necessarily have to be a philosophy major coming out of a liberal arts college to fill these jobs, but you certainly need some level of advanced training beyond high school. And I think that right now there's like a $5 or $6 million job gap just in that sector right now. I think we hear a lot of noise in the press about coding boot camps. That's actually a relatively small sector. 20,000 people graduate from boot camps a year. I think there's colleagues of mine have been reporting more recently about apprenticeship programs, and I think those are very promising. But businesses for a while have not had really the incentives to do that. There's not much in the budget this year to promote that, but I think it's maybe going to have to be something that the states put a lot more effort into, and maybe some chambers of commerces and states will be working together on pushing some of those.
Hopefully that will translate into opportunities. Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Goldie Blumenstyk, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education.